Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Trinity Wall Street. It's great to see you all here. I'm Julian Walkner, Director of Music and the Arts. Dressed a little bit casually tonight because it's very athletic conducting, so I'm in this chemise and not the usual white tie. It's a great honor to welcome Matthew Guerrieri to the stage to deliver the opening lecture for this weekend's Stravinsky Festival. Matthew and I got our doctorate together actually at Boston University. We both had the pleasure of studying under Lucas Foss, and that's left us with a lifetime of stories and memories and all of that. There's a more specific biography in your handout as well. What we'll do is Matthew will give about a half an hour prepared lecture, and then we'll open up for questions for about 15 minutes, and I'll moderate that process, and we'll make sure that everyone who has a question speaks into this microphone. So I'll walk around in Phil Donahue style, and we'll get it all taken care of. So please help me in welcoming Matthew Guerrieri.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to thank Julian for that lovely introduction. Julian played the organ at my wedding. How cool is that? I'd also especially like to thank Melissa Atterbury and Kelvin Chan from Trinity Church, who made my job easier, and I'd like to thank all the musicians whose hard work is providing such an excellent excuse for me to get up here and talk at you. And I'd especially also like to thank all of you for coming out here this evening to Trinity Church. I was mildly disappointed that I wasn't going to be speaking from the pulpit because I wanted to get a picture to send my mother so I could prove to her that a career in music is not necessarily a road to perdition, but upon further reflection, I think some distance between me and the pulpit is safer for everyone involved. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight especially about Threney, which is a piece you're going to hear in a little while. And admittedly, I'm only going to talk about it in a fairly oblique fashion. This talk is sort of a DVD extra deleted scene from the program book in a way. But I should say that Threney is a piece of music that I personally have long been fascinated by. It's music that is very Stravinskyan, but at the same time, it's very unlike anything that Stravinsky ever wrote. It's one of the most extreme pieces that he ever wrote, but it's extreme mostly in terms of a kind of austerity and hermeticism. And it's a piece in which Stravinsky went as far out on some stylistic limbs as he would ever go. It's certainly his most unfiltered exercise in 12-tone composition, the zenith, or maybe the nadir, depending on your taste, of his adoption of serial techniques late in his life. In a very strange way, it's even, in one sense, as close as he ever got to aleatoric music because of the way he treats the 12-tone rows in this piece, especially in the canonic sections that take place throughout. Stravinsky often exerts control over the material only insofar as to create some fleeting reference to a major or a minor chord at the entrance of successive canonic voices, but once the voices enter, you kind of have the sense that the rows are spinning out almost coincidentally, with this sense that the resulting harmonies are, in a strangely literal sense, catch as catch can. But Threney is also a piece, and this is what really fascinates me, that demonstrates in somewhat amplified form something that happens with a lot of Stravinsky's music. And that is that there are certain surface features of the music that initially seem like they're going to be windows into some deeper understanding of it, some key to why it sounds the way it does or why Stravinsky wrote it. But upon closer inspection, the windows turn out to be not very clear at all. Now, a lot of them are musical. There are hints throughout Threney of Stravinsky's previous styles, but as soon as you get close to them, they stubbornly remain only hints. They become only more elusive as one tries to sort of pin them down or relate them to a specific other piece. And then there's the choice of text to set verses from the Lamentations of Jeremiah to reintroduce them into the modern world is to invite speculation that it is the modern world that is coming in for a good scold. And there probably was some sense of that in Stravinsky's conception, but there's also this strong sense of being archaic for its own sake. Stravinsky had a well-developed habit of accessorizing his music with the borrowed grandeur of ancient ritual. And this feature extends throughout Stravinsky's late period. And if you listen to all of this weekend's collection of elegies and memorials and requiems, it can sometimes be hard to tell where Stravinsky's regard for the dead picks up and his regard simply for dead languages leaves off. As one decidedly unsympathetic critic was heard to object at Threany's premiere, it's not a concert, it's a cemetery. But there's one more collection of connections that we might speculate on. And it has to do with one of Threany's historical predecessors, and it's actually a piece that Trinity denizens had a chance to hear a few weeks ago. And those are the two settings from the Lamentations of Jeremiah by the English Renaissance composer Thomas Tallis. Now, as with most other composers who may or may not have influenced him, Stravinsky mentioned Tallis only in passing. He acknowledged that he had studied Tallis's Lamentations setting, along with another setting by William Byrd, who was Tallis's student and later his colleague. But Stravinsky insisted that any musical influence was only very broad or slight at best. And I think this is true. If you look at the scores, if anything, it's Byrd's setting that seems to have seeped through a little bit into Threany. There is one section of Byrd's Lamentations in particular, this little stretch of imitative polyphony that's setting the Hebrew letter Teth that seems awfully Stravinsky-like. It's full of all these 3/2 polyrhythms, and there's one particular repeated motive that Byrd uses, this descending step followed by a descending fifth, that is just possibly, or possibly not, echoed in the 12-tone row at the core of Threany. But nothing in Tallis's setting comes even this close to it. But I think Tallis can be a suggestive connection in other ways. His sheer presence in the repertoire might very well have given Stravinsky ideas on how to approach modernism and serialism in a suitably idiosyncratic way. Stravinsky began to sample the serialist waters just as the burgeoning early music movement was kind of revealing itself as a cousin of the avant-garde. The virtues of historically informed performance and of post-Webern modernism were actually very congruent: clarity and precision and objectivity. Stravinsky would have experienced this confluence firsthand thanks to his new assistant at the time, Robert Kraft. Kraft was a conductor who often conducted early music and often conducted early music in new music settings. There's one particular concert that I think of in which Kraft conducted both of Tallis's Lamentation settings on the first half, and then on the second half, Pierre Boulez conducted his own modernist masterpiece, Les Marteaux sans Maître. So for Stravinsky, who had often outfitted his provocations with references to musical antiquity, this sort of alliance between old and new could provide some form of welcome cover. But the connection that I find most interesting has to do with something to which Stravinsky was particularly attentive, and it's also something that Tallis apparently mastered with either purposeful or unwitting grace, and it has to do with a composer's career. Now, the idea that the progress of a composer's career could be viewed as a narrative arc in itself is a product of the 19th century. Like so many nagging music history hangovers, it started with Beethoven, whose career was the prototype for the sort of early period, middle period, late period sort of biographical thinking that soon cropped up everywhere and still does crop up. What is unusual about Stravinsky, I think, is the extent to which he tried to consciously manage that career narrative. Stravinsky was someone who was always very aware of where he stood in contemporary estimation, and he was also very aware of how what he wrote and how he talked about what he wrote could shape that estimation. Much of the reaction to the Rake's Progress, for instance, the piece that came right before Stravinsky turned to serialism, much of that reaction seemed to be trying to place Stravinsky in his late period already. And so adopting serialist techniques was, in some small part, a way that Stravinsky could remap the boundaries. What some critics might have thought was a final curtain could be revealed as just another act break. But the move was reactive as well as proactive. It was Stravinsky's response to the shift in the cultural weather. It was a deliberate effort to remain part of the musical vanguard, and it was something that, back in the 1500s, Thomas Tallis had done exceptionally well. Tallis's career was one of his most notable achievements, and it was already being noted in his own time. Tallis's grave is now lost. It was either dug up or built over or otherwise obliterated sometime in the 18th century, we think. But the epitaph on his tombstone was recorded, and the epitaph pretty much extols the salient facts. It says this: "He served long time in chapel with great praise, 4 sovereigns' reigns, a thing not often seen." And these were not just any 4 sovereigns. They were Henry VIII, who broke with Rome and established the Anglican Church, Henry's teenage son, Edward VI, under whose reign the church was reformed along more radically Lutheran lines, Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, who briefly returned England to the Catholic fold, and Henry's youngest daughter, Elizabeth, who steered the ship of state back into Protestant currents. And I'm realizing as I'm reading this, if you factor in the 9 days of Lady Jane Grey, that's 5 sovereigns that he served under. And each transition of power brought with it a fairly drastic reboot of the state religion. And yet throughout it all, Tallis maintained his place in the Chapel Royal, staying at the center of English religious life over 4 decades of religious upheaval, which is fairly amazing. Now, that ability to adapt and thrive is something that I think Stravinsky would have appreciated and maybe even envied a little bit. But more importantly for us, the listeners today, it links Stravinsky and Tallis in a way that makes us think about just what it is we're listening to. Because like Stravinsky, Tallis's seeming ability to master new styles and necessities as they came along created both admiration and a kind of mistrust. For a long time after his death, Tallis was known almost exclusively for the English language anthems he composed during Edward's reign. The most famous one is If Ye Love Me, which still, God knows my church choir does it a lot. This sort of focus on the English language repertoire created an image of Tallis as the father of English cathedral music, and that's how he was referred to throughout much of the 1700s and 1800s. But particularly towards the end of the 1800s, much of Tallis's other music began to be performed and published. For example, the Latin motets that he wrote both early and late in his career, as well as the masses that he composed in the years when Mary had brought back the Catholic liturgy. Suddenly, Tallis went from an Anglican exemplar to someone who, it seemed, bent a little too easily in the prevailing wind. His fantastic 40-voice motet, Spem in Alium, was rediscovered and publicly performed during the Victorian era, and the reaction to it is quite revealing. The ingenuity of the piece was obvious and was often presented as evidence of English musical genius, but there was also this sort of sense that the motet was a stunt. It was kind of a one-off. It was cleverness for its own sake. Revealing, too, is the comparison with his colleague William Byrd. Both Byrd and Tallis started out Catholics, and most research has concluded that they both stayed Catholics, even as England turned Protestant. But Byrd was always regarded as much more the true believer, the noble recusant, the one whose music was charged with that sense of loss and defiance, the style faithful to the drama of the old Catholic polyphony. Whereas Tallis was, again, considered to be more facile than faithful, his music much more attuned to novelty and innovation, but somehow shallower as a result. This is how Richard Runciman Terry, the great promoter of Renaissance music in early 20th century England, compared Tallis and Byrd, and he wrote, "Tallis lacked the spiritual exaltation which could carry Byrd through a long work. Tallis was frankly human, and it isn't in the nature of purely human emotion to wear itself out by its very intensity. It is otherwise when the motive force is spiritual in character. Hence we find Byrd, right to the end of a long work, carried to flight after flight of ecstasy." Now this is so reminiscent of something that the mid-century musicologist and critic Paul Henry Lang said about Stravinsky that even though I already quoted it in the program book, I'm just going to go ahead and repeat it. And Lang writes, "Of late, Stravinsky has turned to religious subjects. Is he a genuinely religious composer of sacred music? No, he could not be, for his ideal world is too little concerned with the final inwardness of life. In reality, nowhere in the many works written since he became representative of contemporary Western music was he able to transcend his egoism." Now, this is not coincidental, I think. One does not have to go very far to find assessments of Tallis that could easily double as assessments of Stravinsky. Here's one from musicologist David Maroney, and he writes, "Here indeed is a characteristic which seems to hold true for Tallis throughout his long life. He seems to have been able to identify in each of his contemporaries what they most had to offer him." And here's another one from Peter Phillips, the director of the Tallis Scholars, describing Tallis as, quote, "happiest making experiments, pushing out the frontiers of what he had inherited more as a mathematical exercise than as a series of lessons in word setting and deeper meaning." So it turns out the boxes we like to tick off in categorizing Stravinsky are hardly exclusive to him. A consideration of Tallis's Lamentations settings in particular and their reception gives some indication of the friction that can result from trying to resolve the narrative of a career like Talas's, and by analogy, Stravinsky's, with this sort of post-romantic idea of artistic sincerity. Talas's settings, which are in Latin, in fact do not date from the reign of Mary, when the Catholic Church was restored. They most likely date from the early part of Elizabeth's reign, after that restoration was shut down. Byrd's lamentation setting was composed around the same time, and virtually all the commentary on it has heard in it a very personal statement of faith, the style deliberately looking back to contrapuntal Catholic practice, and the final line of the setting, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, convertere ad Dominum Deum tuum, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, return unto thy God, is usually interpreted as an anguished exhortation to England itself. But theories about Talas's lamentation settings, in spite of having the exact same final line, they run the gamut. For every speculation there is that Tallis wrote them as some sort of act of dissonance for use in private clandestine Catholic services, there's a counter-insistence that Tallis was simply engaging in some sort of stylistic exercise, adopting a dark and dramatic text for the purpose of experimenting with some dark and dramatic sounds. And so it becomes easy to say that Byrd's devotion to Catholicism and the Catholic cause grounded his music, gave him an anchor, while Tallis's more casual piety meant that he was unmoored, forever searching for novelty, always anxiously looking around the next corner. And again, this is a judgment that, as we've heard, was also rendered on Stravinsky. But then again, it's just a judgment. It's an interpretation. You can spin it the other way. It's just as easy to say that Byrd's faith trapped him stylistically, while Tallis's supposed comparative inconstancy is what gave him the freedom to continually expand his musical horizons. And even that, too, is just another narrative. So the question is, which narratives get us closer to the music? Which ones tell us something that helps us understand? Do any of them, in fact? Stravinsky once asked, "What can one say about music that is so unmysterious and so easy to follow at every level and in all relationships?" The answer, of course, is that reviewers, who must earn their livelihood, will find a great deal of nothing to say. Now, while I thank Igor for allowing me my livelihood, I must acknowledge this possibility that this entire lecture, this whole Stravinsky-Tallis hermeneutic slash fiction, is yet more nothing to say. And yet Stravinsky, at one time, added a chapter himself. Many people today, Stravinsky once wrote, are too ready to condemn a composer for, quote, not being able to hear what he has written. In fact, if he is a real composer, he always does hear, at least by calculation, everything he writes. Tallis calculated the 40 parts of Spem in Alium. He did not hear them. Now, on first glance, this seems to admit to all those demurrals about Stravinsky, and about Tallis for that matter, that they were more attuned to craft than expression, that they were more technicians and mechanics or musical computer programmers than creative artists. But Stravinsky's formula, that hearing and calculation are not so easily separable, raises the question of how much that applies to the listener as well as the composer, because we too both hear and calculate at the same time. And so I like to imagine that's why Thraney includes a particular pair of verses from the Lamentations that neither Tallis nor Byrd included in their own settings. And they're from chapter 3, they're verses 49 and 51. The first one emphasizes the physical side of lament, the outward demonstration. It emphasizes the tears, and it reads, "Mine eye trickleth down and ceaseth, can't do the King James today. Mine eye trickleth down and ceaseth not, without any intermission." The second, though, reverses our usual expectations of cause and effect between emotion and expression. And it reads, "Mine eye affecteth mine heart, because of all the daughters of my city." Mine eye affecteth my heart. The anguish doesn't create the tears. It is the tears that create the anguish. And it's likewise with Stravinsky. The need to express doesn't dictate the technique. The working out of the technique creates the expression. The music is Stravinsky's responsibility, and in some sense, the music is Stravinsky's problem. But the sincerity, he seems to say, is in fact ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to let people think a little bit about questions, but I just want to ask one. If you could just describe what the 12-tone method is, because I'm not sure that's common knowledge these days.
The 12-tone method, which was invented by Arnold Schoenberg, it is in essence the final step in an evolution away from triadic tonality. In triadic tonality, the anchor of the piece is the triad, is every piece has a tonal center that you move away from and then come back to, and it's that tension and then the release of that tension that sort of creates the drama of the piece. As harmony began to get more and more chromatic towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, composers really were trying to find all different ways of controlling this harmony, because the flights away from the tonal center were getting so long and so complicated that they had to come up with some other method of doing this. And eventually, it became sort of a virtue that you didn't even want to create in the audience or in the listener any expectation of a tonal center, because that would be just too much of a distraction from really what was going on in the music, which was just all this chromaticism and the expression inherent just in the chromaticism itself. So the 12-tone method, which was invented by Schoenberg, just really formalizes this. You take all 12 notes of the chromatic scale and you order them in some way. And that becomes the base of the piece, rather than a major scale or a minor scale or a major triad or a minor triad. Instead, you have this 12-tone row out of which all of the melodic and harmonic material of the piece is going to be developed. And so in the original sense of 12-tone writing, and in fact Thraney has an awful lot of this, you would just make sure that you didn't repeat a pitch until you had already gone through in some form all 12 notes of the row, and then you could do another row form, and you could invert the row, or you could play the row backwards, and all this stuff. Towards the end of Stravinsky's serialist period, he actually came to a much more sophisticated treatment of the row that allowed a greater control of the moment-to-moment harmony. And most serial composers had arrived at something similar to this as well. But the whole idea is that it's the entire aggregate, the entire collection, is really what's driving the piece, and that's the sound. And instead of responding to sort of the cadential points where you come back to some sort of tonal home base, you're instead responding to the confluence of intervals and the relationships between them. And I happen to love 12-tone music, but it has been the whipping boy for more music criticism over the past 100 years than just about anything else. So it was controversial in its own time. It's still controversial, but I think the best of it, what I love about it is that it makes you listen to everything else that's always going on in music. It puts rhythm and color and timbre and just the sheer sounds of intervals, sheer sounds of dissonances and consonances right up front without having to sort of worry about maintaining this long-term drama. I think it was a response to a need for flexibility, and I think that's one of the reasons that Stravinsky turned to it, although he turned to it well after a lot of other composers had turned to it. But I think it was just this way of just completely rethinking the relationship to the musical materials. And given that Stravinsky's mind was always so attuned to just the sheer working out of the material, in a lot of ways it's kind of surprising that he took as long as he did to start playing around with it. The main reason for that was probably that he wasn't going to do it while Schoenberg was still alive, because they were great rivals. So, in fact, they lived in Los Angeles. They lived in the same city for a decade and never met each other, which I find amazing. But that's both of them were that kind of personality. So.
Question? Do you have a question? Does anyone have a question?
Here we got a question.
Yes, I'll be right back. That's for everyone to hear.
Where was he living when he composed this?
He was living in Beverly Hills.
Oh, it was California.
It was California. He moved there in, I believe, 1939 or 1940, because first he lived in Boston for a year, then he moved out to California, and that was more or less his home up until the last few years of his life when he lived in New York. Throughout all this, of course, he was doing concert tours all the time. He was spending at least half the year in Europe all the time. And so really when you read Stravinsky's biography, it's not so much being in a place or being in a studio, it's a lot of being on boats and trains. So.
I do feel like Phil Donahue.
Thank you very much for your conversation. Stravinsky is one of my favorite composers, but I wanted to know how come these works are rarely performed? Is it because of the complexity or just disinterest?
I think both. They are very difficult, and certainly at the time of their premieres, I don't think any of them ever got really good performances, so that very much affected it. The premiere of Threney was not a good performance. The premiere of the Canticum Sacrum nearly ran off the rails because Kraft had done all the rehearsals, and then Stravinsky got up to conduct and they couldn't follow his beat. I mean, so it's a little bit of both. I think that in good performances, these pieces have just create a sound world all their own, but I think it's only very recently that sort of people have taken the time to do really good performances of them. This is a big problem with a lot of 20th century music, in which sort of the compositional techniques seem to race ahead of the performing abilities of people out there. Another great example is Elliott Carter, who I feel like it was only really around the time that Elliott Carter turned 100 that suddenly there were just an enormous crop of musicians who really got how to perform it, who had both the technical ability but also just knew how to phrase it and knew what he was going for and knew how to bring that out, and all of a sudden you would hear these performances and they would be just absolutely beautiful. And these are pieces that were at the time, 40, 50 years old. So I think that Stravinsky's late works were just, especially for, even for orchestras who had, mastered the Rite of Spring, it was just a completely new set of technical difficulties. And I think one of the biggest problems with their reception was just waiting for musicians to catch up with the demands of the music.
I think I'll add something to that, because I agree completely that we're at a point now where these musicians have now grown up on Elliott Carter and Boulez, and this music that was written in the 60s, now it seems like it was written in the last 10 years, actually, some of it. And The Flood and Abraham and Isaac in particular. And what's great about the orchestra that we have tonight is that, many of them are ACJW types, they've done all the top conservatories, they've grown up on this stuff. So for them, the Rite of Spring is, they did that in high school. So now, in college and post-college, they've been very comfortable in this idiom, which is the only way that we could put this music together for this weekend in the way that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was listening to rehearsal this afternoon, and you can tell they just, not only do they understand they can play the notes, but they understand what the sound is supposed to be, they understand how it's supposed to phrase, and that is just such a huge difference. It's actually interesting that this is music, again, coming out at the same time as really the early music movement finding its footing, and the early music movement, faced a lot of the same problems. And they got to it sooner, but it was, again, waiting until there were sort of a critical core of musicians who understood the style enough to not just play the notes, but start playing the music. So I think that's another way in which this late Stravinsky and early music have sort of an unlikely sort of cousinship.
Yeah, what's great about this choir is they spend, 70% of their time in early music, either here or throughout the city and the world. So, I said, not to be arrogant on behalf of the choir, because I think they're great. You all know I think they're great. But I did say to them that up to this point, there hasn't really been ensembles on this earth who had the level of understanding and sophistication with early music and contemporary music that are now merged into one. Yeah. And it's a really special time in history, not only here at Trinity Wall Street, but throughout North America and in Europe, where this interest has gotten to the point of really ultra specialization and expertise in early music and contemporary music.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always been fascinated because once you realize that, you realize just how much of the early music movement is basically a modernist artistic movement in a lot of ways, because it's just going after the same things, and now it's, in the past decade or so, we've just seen them sort of merge and increasingly cross the lines the way they did at the beginning.
Are there other questions for Matthew? Yes. Let me get the mic to you.
Could you talk a little about how Stravinsky went about setting text and how the text influenced the music and his concept of the text musically came about?
Well, if you believe Stravinsky, the text didn't influence the music at all. And he would repeatedly say that the text, is always the musical considerations. There's one particular interview where he's like, people are always saying that my text setting is awkward, and darn right it's awkward because the music comes first. I think also, I think a lot of his conception of text setting had to do with chant, which is what he would have known as a young person. That would have been the bulk of the music. Certainly all of the sacred music he heard would have been Slavonic chant, which is sort of, this less attentive to the word stress and more attentive to just being very even and very declamatory. I think that particularly when the text calls for something lyrical, Stravinsky comes to a place which is unexpected but still really honors the text. I think that's where he's in his best. So I think like the parts of a sermon, a narrative, and a prayer, the text setting is in some ways completely off the wall, but in other ways he just sort of really hits the sweet spot of just matching it up with the color and with sort of the rhythm in a way that's kind of unexpected but works. The tenor solo in the Canticum Sacrum is the same way. But then you have pieces like, the Mass. There's places in the Mass where the word stress is so perverse that you just feel like Stravinsky was doing it just to mess with people. I mean, the credo of the Mass is just, it's like every other word is stressed wrong, and it's almost, in some ways, it's meant to evoke chant, but in other ways, it's just sort of Stravinsky reminding you that he's driving the car, I think. So, it's interesting that his English text setting, I've actually find usually very persuasive. I think the Rake's Progress, there's some text setting decisions in there that I think a native English speaker would never make, and yet they work brilliantly as drama, and they work brilliantly as sort of clever musical bits. So, but it's always, he had sort of this very fractious relationship with text setting, but I think he enjoyed the fact that it was fractious. He enjoyed sort of pushing the text around a little bit, and you can certainly hear that in all of these late pieces in at some point or another.
Thank you very much, Matthew. At the end of your lecture, you brought up a point about the difference between expression and technique. And you said this wasn't the technique that created the expression, it was the expression that created the technique. Can you say more about that? Stravinsky said more about that?
He didn't really talk about it much. He mainly, when Stravinsky is talking about sort of expressive music, he's often using it as sort of a cudgel to beat up other composers, sometimes named, sometimes not. For example, when he talked about the Symphony of Psalms, he said one of the reasons he chose Psalm 150 was because he wanted to sort of rescue it from other composers who had abused it by projecting onto it their own lyrico-sentimental feelings or something like that. I think what it is in Stravinsky is he puts so much faith in just the sheer technique, the sheer working out of the music. To him, I think what he believed was that's what he could control. That's what he couldn't sort of control how the audience would react to something. He couldn't control like trying to do something dramatic and then the audience would laugh at it or something. So I think what he put his faith in was just he could control the notes on the page and by extension the notes and the rhythms in performance. And he just worked that so deeply and worked it so intricately and so obsessively that it sort of, whatever expression was going to come out, it was going to come out in the working out of it. And I think it is actually different from sort of composers who just have an image or you know, feel, you know, some sort of particular emotional idea and then sort of try and find the technique to express it. Stravinsky was very much the other way around. The pieces I think you can hear it the best in, oddly enough, on this weekend's concert are the little Russian language a cappella motets he wrote in the 20s and 30s, because they are both very, very, they project a very particular mood, and yet they're so almost deliberately non-expressive in comparison with other similar pieces. And I think that's really Stravinsky sort of just pulling back, and I think it very much was, you know, sort of a musical version of the Serenity Prayer, which is, you know, he wanted the control over the things he could control, and he wasn't going to worry about the things he couldn't, and he spent most of his life really trying to really hone the difference between the two. But you know, but I also think there's a lot of music where Stravinsky is being expressive, and he can do it, and I just think he just never liked to admit it, because it would have created a different image of him as a composer than he wanted to project. But
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Before we get another question, I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit in preparing people for The Flood and what that piece is all about.
The Flood is one of the weirdest pieces Stravinsky ever wrote. The Flood was written for television. It's a television opera. It was commissioned it was commissioned under the expectation that Stravinsky would deliver something similar to Amal and the Night Visitors. And instead he delivered The Flood, which is dramatically very strange, because instead of just being the flood, it actually goes all the way from creation through the fall of Adam and Eve, through Noah and the flood, and it does it just like in like little short bursts of narrative. And it also changes style, both narratively and musically, about every 3 or 4 minutes. And so it's just all these short little tableaux that come across. And in essence, it's a very Stravinskyan piece, because it's very much just put the idea front and center and don't really elaborate on it at all. But so in performance, it tends to be much more sort of like a melodrama. So there's narration, and then a musical thing happens, and then there's more narration, and then a musical thing happens, and sometimes there's music underneath the narration. And it's sort of, the way I think about it is, it's almost like if you're going to do the first few chapters of the Bible as a news report in very archaic English, because all the sources come from very archaic English. So it's at the same time a piece in which it's telling this very familiar story in ways that are almost designed to alienate you out of your familiarity with it. But at the same time, it's telling it in what I find to be such an efficiently colorful manner. It's really one of his most colorful works, and the way he changes color constantly in it, and the way he utilizes the forces to deliver so many different shades of color in it is really quite amazing. It's sort of to just make you rethink this story, and it's like seeing a familiar story told in a very unfamiliar way. But I cannot tell whether at some point just Stravinsky kind of gave up on the whole television aspect of it and decided he was just going to write what he was going to write, because it did not work well on television at all. It was actually, the broadcast was kind of a disaster. Or if it was just, you know, Stravinsky presented something that was just so far ahead of its time that television didn't really know what to do with it, and they tried to do it as a very traditional, uplifting, artsy 1960s television show, and it just didn't fit at all. Because I think one of the great things about The Flood is just kind of how strange and almost playful it is, in the way that it just sort of keeps pinballing from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing, and yet it's just sort of barely hanging on to this familiar narrative thread that we all know from Sunday school. So to hear it is actually fairly rare, and so it's a great chance to hear it tonight, because I think the more I got into it, the more I realized that this was really one of his major pieces, even though it seems very minor in a lot of ways. But you can almost feel Stravinsky finally get so comfortable with this serialist technique that he's like, oh, I can do whatever I want, and he proceeds to do whatever he wants, often at very strange times, but it all works out. So.
One thing that you'll notice about the whole 12-tone thing, after the introduction, the harp, you'll see my pattern will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And those 12 notes are the 12-tone rows, so it's something to capture there. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has a burning desire, or we could just say thank you.
Thank you. That was fun. Okay. Nice. Thank you. I need to find the sound guy. Oh, there he is.